I'm Michael Moreland. I'm a law professor at Villanova University outside of Philadelphia and spending this year as the Marianne Remick Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture here at Notre Dame. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague at the Center for Ethics and Culture, Gilbert Meilaender. Gilbert Meilaender is the Richard and Phyllis Duesenberg Chair in Theological Ethics at Valparaiso University and the Paul Ramsey Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame. One of the nation's preeminent bioethicists, Professor Meilaender has written extensively on the body, human identity, and the meaning of emerging technologies. He received his PhD from Princeton University, and before moving to Valparaiso in 1996, taught at the University of Virginia and at Oberlin College. He has served on the editorial board and as an associate editor of the Journal of Religious Ethics, as associate editor for Religious Studies Review, and on the editorial board of the annual The Society of Christian Ethics and the editorial advisory board of First Things. His books include Should We Live Forever? The Ethical Ambiguities of Aging, Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, and Body, Soul, and Bioethics. He's a fellow of the Hastings Center and was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics from 2002 to 2008. And earlier this year, this spring, my wife Ann and I were privileged to have been part of a conference at Princeton University honoring Gil for his lifetime of achievement and work, and it's an honor to be with him again today. So please welcome Gil Meilaender.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to you for coming to listen. If you can't, it feels to me as if it's picking me up all right. Is that fine? Okay. Let me make just a couple introductory remarks, two brief comments before I sort of launch into this talk. One is to say that this is a conference about freedom, broadly construed, people taking up a whole range of different topics. What I'm interested in this talk is what you might call the relation between some of the givens of nature, of our natural condition, and our historical freedom to reshape those. But I'm approaching that not so much as a large theoretical question. I'm not trying to develop a big theory about it so much as I want to think about a particular illustration of that, one focus, and I'm going to think about adoption in order to do that. I'm not particularly interested in sending you away with a settled doctrine on that, though what I think about the question I'm taking up will be, I think, clear at the end, but I'm more interested in just sort of inviting you to puzzle with me about this relation. So that's the one thing I'd say. The other is to say, just by way of sort of apology to a couple of you, the paper will fall into four sections of slightly unequal length, but four, and one of those sections is roughly similar to something that just a few of you who were at the Medical Ethics Conference in Rome that the Center sponsored a year ago will already have heard a version of. All I can say is, we only have so many ideas in life. My supply is dwindling, and I'm going to reuse that before I'm done. But I think that won't apply to most of you. Pointing to Sophocles' story of Oedipus as an example of one way in which mythic stories in Western culture have depicted adoption, Marianne Novi writes, "The plot of Oedipus is based on the assumption that parenthood is a matter of genetics which determines identity. And so to say, as Oedipus does in the play, 'I will know who I am,' is," Novi writes, "to define your parentage as your identity." Doing so, however, is not as obvious as it might at first sight seem. Nature has its claims upon us, of course, but so does history. In a well-ordered world, those claims might not seem to be in competition, but alas, we do not live in well-ordered worlds a lot of the time. Critics, Novi reminds us, critics almost always refer to Laius and Jocasta as Oedipus' father and mother, without regard to the fact that they both wanted him killed as an infant, or that Jocasta spent only 3 days with the baby before giving him to the shepherd to expose. And to think about the meaning and significance of adoption is to reflect upon lives in which nature and history are not harmoniously ordered. And I want to take up several sort of illustrations or puzzling examples as an invitation to engage in such reflection. Here's the first illustration, and these are fairly long illustrations. In George Eliot's novel Silas Marner, published in 1861, a series of tragic events makes Silas, who is a reclusive weaver without family or friends, makes him the adoptive father for a little orphaned girl whom he names Eppie. Eppie's opium-addicted mother, Molly, had died of exposure on a cold and snowy winter's evening, having been unable to get Godfrey Cass, to whom she was secretly married, to acknowledge his paternity. He married her in a sort of a youthful fit of enthusiasm, but she really wasn't a wife suitable to his social status. The little girl wandered into Silas' cottage. He cared for her, and since her mother was dead and her father unknown, he continued to raise her as his daughter. There weren't any children's services agencies to intervene. When Silas wonders whether he really has a right to the child, Mrs. Winthrop, a kind-hearted neighbor, tells him, "You'll have a right to her if you're a father to her." Given the circumstances under which Eppie had come to him, and given the evidence in her hair and eyes that Eppie is not Silas' biological child, it would be impossible for Silas to pretend that he and his daughter had been joined by nature through a biological tie, nor does he attempt that. As Eppie grows older, Silas shares with her some of the details of how she had come to live with him. Eppie puzzles a good bit over her mother, who had died in the snow, but she gives relatively little thought to the father, whom she has never known. After all, Eliot writes, had she not a father very close to her who loved her better than real fathers in the village seemed to love their daughters? It's an interesting sentence. In some ways, it seems very simple and rings true, but it may also leave us a little puzzled. Eppie has a father, indeed a close and loving father, better than other fathers in the village. That's actually not quite the way the sentence went. What Eliot writes is that she has this father who's a loving father and that is better than any of the real fathers in the village. So in the very sentence that seems to affirm in the strongest possible terms Silas' fatherhood, in that same sentence, those whose tie to their daughters is not just biological but also historical are characterized as real fathers. I think in terms of the larger story, though, that's sort of a blip in the plot. It's hard to miss that the story gives to Eppie the last word on this question. Her biological father, Godfrey Cass, had experienced Molly's death as liberating. It had been a mistake to marry her in the first place. He was free. He then married Nancy Lamater, a woman who was a far more respectable choice for a wife than Molly had been. Years pass. Godfrey and Nancy remain childless, and he finally tells Nancy that Eppie is actually his child. Thinking that they are in a position to give Eppie advantages that Silas cannot, they offer to take her into their home and acknowledge her as Godfrey's child. But Eppie resists the idea, wanting to remain with Silas. Godfrey says, "I have a claim on you, Eppie, the strongest of all claims. I have a natural claim that must stand before every other." That rouses Silas from his normal reticence. He's not a man who says much. Sort of pitting history against nature, Silas replies, "It's me she's been calling her father ever since she could say the word." And it's Eppie, then, who finally settles the matter in the following exchange with Nancy. Nancy says to her, "What you say is natural, my dear child. It's natural you should cling to those who've brought you up. But there's a duty you owe to your lawful father. When your father opens his home to you, I think it's right you shouldn't turn your back on it." "I can't feel as if I've got any father but one," said Eppie impetuously, while the tears gathered. And it's hard, I think, to imagine most readers of the story not sort of adding their amen to the feeling Eppie expresses, and it's hard to imagine George Eliot not intending that they should. However strong the claims of nature may be, in this story, those claims really pale into insignificance over against the shared familial history of Silas and Eppie. How puzzling, then, that George Eliot should have written another novel, Daniel Deronda, published in 1876, that's about 15 years later than Silas Marner, which makes a powerful case for the view that adoptees must learn their heredity in order to know who they really are. To attempt to summarize the plot of this mammoth novel, I don't know if any of you have ever read it, it's just enormous. You sort of have to set aside a major chunk of your life to read it. And trying to summarize it is beyond my powers. It's really at least two stories. It's the story of Daniel Deronda and the story of a woman named Gwendolyn Harleth. The stories intersect in a number of ways. Critics, at least as far as I've been able to see, have sometimes suggested that it would have been better had Eliot published only one or the other of these two stories, though they don't necessarily agree which of the two it should have been. For my purposes, though, the focus is clearly on Daniel Deronda. He is a young English gentleman who has been raised with love and attention by Sir Hugo Meilaender, whom he calls his uncle. Knowing only that he does not know the identity of his biological father or mother, Daniel cannot help wondering whether Sir Hugo may actually be his father. And he often finds himself longing for a more secure sense of identity and belonging, experiencing, we might say, what some people today have taken to calling genealogical bewilderment. Through a series of twists and turns, rather too fantastic to be entirely believable, at least for this reader. But anyway, through this very complicated plot, Daniel comes to learn that he is Jewish by birth. Having rescued a young Jewish woman named Myra when she was about to take her own life, Daniel, who is drawn to her a little more actually than he perhaps even realizes at first, tries to learn for her whether her mother or brother are still alive. At the same time, he comes to know this strange, mystical Jewish visionary named Ezra Mordecai Cohen. And it turns out, again, through a quite complicated plot, that Mordecai is actually Myra's brother, although it takes Daniel a good while to learn that. And in the meantime, he comes under Mordecai's spell, becoming something like his disciple. Mordecai is a dying man, and he is looking for someone who will carry forward his work, his vision of a restored Jewish nation. He's kind of a proto-Zionist in a way. And he sees in Daniel Deronda that someone to carry forward his vision. And Daniel is not immune to the lure of that. The problem, of course, is that, at least as far as Daniel knows, he's not Jewish. So how could he be the one to carry on this vision? But Mordecai is serenely confident that Daniel is in fact Jewish, and events turn out to support his confidence. Turns out that Deronda's biological mother, a woman named Leonora Halm Eberstein, sends him a letter through Sir Hugo. After having been entirely removed from her child's life for years, she now wants to meet and speak with him. She is Jewish. And it was her desire to be an opera singer, which had been opposed by her rather traditional father, that had really caused the problems in her life. She'd only achieved her desire to become such a singer after her father's death, so that for her being Jewish had been a sort of a narrow, restrictive identity against which she had rebelled with all her heart. Many men had loved her, Sir Hugo among them, but having married her Jewish cousin and given birth to Daniel, she had no desire whatsoever to raise a child. Moreover, she thought that she would be doing her son a favor by releasing him from what she calls the bondage of having been born a Jew. I have not the foolish notion, she says to Daniel, that you can love me merely because I am your mother, whom you have never seen or heard, when you have never seen or heard of me all your life. But I thought I chose something better for you than being with me. I did not think that I deprived you of anything worth having. Despite the fact that his mother continues to affirm her abandonment of him, for Daniel there is something very liberating in learning the truth about his origins. His affection for Sir Hugo remains, but he takes up his Jewish identity very eagerly. It frees him to acknowledge his love for Myra and to see her now as a possible wife for him. It frees him also to make Mordecai's vision his own. He and Myra marry, and they soon leave for what the novel just calls the East, but they are to devote themselves to the recovery of a Jewish homeland. Now, Eliot's two novels taken together, constitute for us, at least for me, and I would hope maybe for you, a kind of puzzle. With her identity shaped by their shared history, Epi is at home with Silas. Living with him as his daughter is where she belongs, and she very forcefully enunciates that in the story. Daniel, though loved with much affection by Sir Hugo, always carries about with him a vague sense of difference, of not quite belonging. For him, that shared history does not overcome a feeling that nature has somehow set him apart. Readers who manage to make their way through the whole of Daniel Deronda are likely to think that in weighing the claims of nature and history, it comes down far more on the side of nature as identity shaping than does Silas Marner. Taken together, the two novels, by the same author, pose for us a problem that they do not solve. My second illustration. Consider the contrasting views of two clergymen. Russell Moore is a Southern Baptist theologian, actually a very well-known Southern Baptist theologian, currently serving as president of that church's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He and his wife have 5 sons, the oldest 2 of whom were born in Russia, orphaned, and adopted by the Moores. The process of adopting these sons came to have far more than personal significance for Russell Moore, however, for the experience compelled him to reflect theologically on what it means to be an adopted child or an adoptive parent. And his 2009 book, titled Adopted for Life, The Priority of Adoption for Christian Families and Churches, is a powerful and engaging explication of the meaning and significance of adoption. There is much in his view we might take up here, much with which to agree and perhaps some with which to disagree. For my purposes at the moment, however, I want to concentrate on just one little strand of his discussion, his opposition to what we might call biological essentialism. From that standpoint, from the standpoint of what he calls biological essentialism, it is traceable genetic material that creates the parent-child bond. And then adoption becomes, if you're committed to that view, adoption becomes, he says, simply a kind of second-best fallback option for couples who experience infertility, a plan B for people who can't have children. But for Moore, adoption seems to be something closer to plan A, though perhaps we should say that he, at least in the book, he makes that case only with respect to Christians in particular. But Christians, at any rate, he says, are called to recognize as kin, as their own flesh and blood, those with whom they do not share traceable genetic material. A history of relationship, free commitment sustained over time, is what forms and sustains the bond of father and mother with their children. And how seriously Moore intends this becomes clear in what seems to me, at least, to be the most striking passage in his book that I've found myself thinking about many times. Recalling that when he and his wife adopted their 2 sons from Russia, many people whom they knew encouraged them not to forget to teach these boys about their cultural heritage. And what the people meant in encouraging them in this way was they should teach them about the heritage of their Russian roots. But Moore gives a very different spin to that, and do not fail to see, by the way, the biblical language that pops up in this passage. So people had encouraged them to teach their children their cultural heritage, meaning, as I said by that, their Russian roots. But as we see it, Moore writes, that's not their heritage anymore, and we hardly want to signal to them that they are strangers and aliens, even if welcome ones in our home. We teach them about their heritage, yes, but their heritage as Mississippians. And so the boys learn about their grandfather, a Baptist pastor in the South, their great-grandfather who raised cotton, and the civil rights movement. All that becomes their history, as far as Moore is concerned. And in his view, this approach, this view, is a natural and necessary outgrowth of Christian faith. The New Testament does, after all, use precisely the language of adoption to characterize the manner in which one becomes a Christian, as, for example, in Galatians 4, where St. Paul writes that God sent his Son as our Redeemer so that we might receive adoption as sons. Hence, adoption creates in believers a new identity, a shared identity. Because it is the means by which one comes to belong to the body of Christ, no one belongs by nature, and all who do belong by virtue of their adoption. People will often ask me, Moore writes, what the key to raising adopted children is. I tell them that honestly, we don't know. We don't have any adopted children. The term adopted kid assumes an ongoing difference, something that differentiates him from a regular kid. In an essay titled Adoption After Altruism, Paul Sauer gives a contrasting angle of vision. Sauer is also a clergyman, and he wears several hats as pastor and executive minister of Our Savior Lutheran Church and School in the Bronx, as an assistant professor of religion at Concordia College in Bronxville, New York, and as associate editor of a little magazine called the Lutheran Forum. More immediately germane to my purpose here is that he, like Moore, is the father of 2 internationally adopted children. His understanding of the meaning of adoption is rather different from Moore's, however. In part, his view is different simply because the essay from which I'm going to be quoting focuses on unethical practices that have sometimes marked international adoptions, even and especially those done under the auspices of Christian adoption agencies. But more generally, he rejects what he calls the altruistic adoption image, which, at least in his mind, pictures the adopted child as one who has been rescued from a hopeless, poverty-stricken, and abandoned life to something far better. We should not, he says, characterize an adopted child as lucky or fortunate. Instead, he writes, a lucky child would be one where there would be no need for adoption because the biological parents would be able to raise the child themselves. But Sauer is not just troubled by unethical practices. He believes that the altruistic adoption image seduces us into overlooking the continuing importance of biological ties in the life of the adopted child. Children adopted from other countries may, he says, be left with little to no sense of their own history. I feel he needs to really engage in conversation with Russell Moore there. Sauer insists that while, to be sure, as he says, the adoption of children can make them part of an ethnically different family, it remains the case that adoption does not change their own ethnicity. So that at least on the face of it, the contrast with Russell Moore's approach could hardly be more striking. That contrast will not disappear. I don't want to make it disappear, but it is fair to note that both Moore and Sauer qualify their views in order to acknowledge the complex relation of nature and history in adoption. Sauer sees that, as he says, there will always be a need for adoption in a world distorted and broken by sin. And even after asserting that the child's ethnicity remains what it was, even after adoption, he notes how important it is that adoptive parents should respect that the tradition out of which the child comes, but the way he puts it is, should incorporate that culture into their own family's traditions. That is to say, while the adoptive family's shared life is enriched and expanded by honoring the culture from which their child came, it is still true that the child is drawn into their own family's traditions, so that by virtue of the history of their relationship, those traditions have become the child's, and Sauer, cannot simply deny that. Likewise, there are ways in which Moore gives nuance to his position that he develops pretty aggressively and straightforwardly in the book. On the one hand, as I noted in that passage that I find so striking, he asserts that the cultural heritage of his 2 adopted sons is no longer Russian, but Mississippian. And yet the very theological premise that grounds his viewpoint requires a certain qualification. For in the end, he clearly believes the heritage of Christians is determined by their incorporation into Christ. And so he writes, whether our background is Norwegian or Haitian or Indonesian, if we are united to Christ, our family genealogy is found not primarily in the front pages of our dusty old family Bible, but inside its pages in the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Our identity is in Christ, so his people are our people, his God, our God. Now, taken as seriously as Moore certainly means that, however, it has to mean that the fundamental heritage of his sons is neither Russian nor Mississippian in any simple sense. The story that tells who they are is the story the Bible tells. And perhaps when their lives are located within that story, there may be room for ways in which their identity is marked by both the Russia of their natural birth and the Mississippi of their history. As we might expect, Moore and Sauer agree on a great deal. I mean, they're two Protestant clergymen, after all. Nevertheless, their emphases do differ. For Sauer, the bonds of nature are just stronger than they are for Moore, whereas for Moore, the meaning of a shared history trumps nature and biology more fully than Sauer thinks it does. Actually, I feel in our current cultural circumstance, I have to stop using trump as a verb, you know. I mean, but at any rate, taken together, their contrasting positions pose for us, once again, a continued problem in need of reflection. My third illustration. This is going to be a long one. Scholars on Muslim law write, traditional Muslim law does not appear to allow formal adoption because it refuses to accept the legal fiction which an adoption creates, namely that an adopted child can become equal to a blood relative of the adopting father. Indeed, so strong is the emphasis in Islam on the blood relation that no history of relationship, however long enduring, can efface it. When an adopted son reaches puberty, his adoptive mother will have to begin to veil herself in his presence, and no physical intimacy such as hugs or kisses will be permitted between them. They're possible sexual partners, we could say. When an adopted daughter reaches puberty, she will need to veil herself in the presence of her adoptive father. And again, no physical intimacy will be permitted. The significance of the blood tie can be seen in a story about Muhammad and a slave boy named Zaid, whom he adopted. Despite the adoption, after Zaid had divorced his wife, Muhammad married her, the divorced wife of his adopted son, and this was considered permissible precisely because there was no biological tie between Muhammad and Zaid. And this action has, it's referred to frequently, this action emphasized for Muslims the difference between real parenthood and adoption, since marriage to a woman who has ever been married to one's own son is forbidden in the Quran, but this was permitted. This does not mean that adoption is forbidden or even frowned upon in Muslim cultures. That's not quite the right way to put it. In fact, something like it is commended as admirable, to care for those who need care. But that bond between adoptive parent and adoptive child, however long extended, is neither a substitute for nor a replacement for the biological bond between parents and child. The adopted child's identity remains distinct and is in no way absorbed into that of the adoptive family. So really what we should say is that Islamic thought commends, and it does commend, but it commends a relation that is something more like what we would probably call long-term foster care, while at the same time denying that any adoptive relation could equal the significance of the blood relation. So that clearly the relation between nature and history is complicated in Islamic thought about familial bonds, and nature has a very clear priority. That relation is likewise complicated in Judaism, at least for Orthodox Jews. Consider this thought experiment offered by Rabbi Michael Gold. He writes, imagine two babies, one born to a Gentile woman and the other to a Jewish woman, and then exchanged at birth. The Gentile baby is raised in a Jewish home to be a committed, even observant Jew. The Jewish baby is raised in a Christian home, knowing nothing of its biological origins. Later in life, the truth comes out. By Jewish law, the way that the child is raised is considered irrelevant. The child born a Jew will be considered a Jew. The child born a Gentile remains a Gentile. In Judaism, biology is everything. Now, to be sure, to read Rabbi Gold is to realize that he does not, in fact, think that biology is quite everything in Jewish thought, and it's not, as we'll see, but it is a great deal. To be a Jew, one must either be born of a Jewish mother or undergo conversion. Moreover, one born of a Jewish mother simply is a Jew, whether he knows it or not, whether he accepts it or not. It's just an ontological reality. It's just there. In our world, in which assisted reproduction procedures are gradually becoming more widespread, this can and sometimes has led to puzzles for which there is no obvious solution. For example, suppose an infertile Jewish couple hires a gestational surrogate, who happens not to be Jewish, to bear a child produced in the laboratory by joining their own sperm and ova. The baby has a natural genetic tie to the husband and wife, but no such tie to the woman who serves as the surrogate. Nevertheless, if the procedure succeeds and comes to term and the child is born, the child of these Jewish parents, a child born to a Gentile woman, cannot easily be said to be Jewish unless the child undergoes conversion. Although, like Muslims, they emphasize the significance of the blood tie, Jews' central concern has to do not with what is permitted in sexual relationships, which is so important in Islamic thought, but with defining who is truly a Jew. But the emphasis on biology does affect to some extent what is permitted or prohibited in sexual relations. So, for example, the laws governing what is called yichud hold that a man and a woman who are not married should not be privately secluded with each other, since they could view each other as possible sexual partners. Parents are, however, permitted to be alone with their biological children, even children of the opposite sex, since the taboo against incest is strong enough to serve as protection there. What about seclusion with an adopted child of the opposite sex? Well, that's hard to place within a Jewish framework, and at least as far as I can tell, halakhic authorities actually have disagreed about whether close physical contact with adopted children in those circumstances is permitted. But it is identity as a Jew, membership in the Jewish people, that most clearly raises the problem of the relation between nature and history. A Gentile child who was adopted by Jewish parents and who is to be raised as a Jew would need, as I noted before, to undergo a conversion ceremony in order to be recognized as a Jew. That conversion, while it would make the child a Jew rather than a Gentile, would not completely undo the effects of biological lineage. So, for example, an adopted child who has undergone conversion to Judaism is permitted to reject his conversion and relinquish his Jewish identity when he reaches the age for bar mitzvah, whereas this would be just a kind of impossibility for someone who had been born a Jew. There's no way, as it's ontologically impossible. More thought-provoking still, Rabbi Gold, whom I quoted when I started on this discussion, Rabbi Gold, who is father to both an adopted son and an adopted daughter, notes that strictly speaking, he writes, strictly speaking, our son and daughter, although raised in the same household, would be permitted by Jewish law to marry one another since they are not consanguineous. I think, however, it's pretty clear that's more a theoretical than a real possibility. Rabbi Gold notes it not because of its likelihood, but simply in order to demonstrate that Jewish law just doesn't have a notion of adoption quite like the one that we tend to work with. So while it's not quite right to say that biology is everything in Judaism, it is true to say that it's quite a lot, and that the natural tie has profound and continuing effects in life. So Shelley Kapnick Rosenberg writes, for a people which intuitively perceives the importance of generations of connectedness through blood and mutual history, it can be emotionally difficult to bestow full membership on one who does not share that connectedness. We can understand that, but you can also wonder whether that really does justice to the feelings Jewish adoptive parents are likely to have toward their children. As one such father writes, the notion that I am doing a deed of kindness to a stranger is not what I feel. I feel him unequivocally to be my own son. That is to say, he experiences in his life the difficulties of relating nature and history as a Jewish father. Within Jewish tradition, the influential thought of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik offers a way to recognize the significance of biological lineage while also placing it within a more expansive framework. Rabbi Soloveitchik distinguishes two kinds of parenthood in his essay, Parenthood Natural and Redeemed. For Soloveitchik, a new kind of fatherhood appears with Abraham, a fatherhood that he says is responsive, and these are his words, not only to biological pressure, but to the call of conscience. The father becomes a teacher charged with passing on the covenantal tradition to the next generation. Something similar happens to motherhood in the redeemed community. Soloveitchik writes, Sarah became the first mother in the sense that her motherhood stemmed not only from instinctual involvement due to biological pressure, but from free commitment as well. This widens the reach of fatherhood and motherhood. For elevated to a universal spiritual level, it is, as Soloveitchik puts it, no longer rooted in biological facticity. And from this perspective, he can even make a virtue of the fact that Judaism has had no practice of adoption, as we understand it. He writes, "The Romans, to whom the idea of covenant was alien, who in spite of their advanced technological achievements never freed themselves from the bonds of the natural community, tried to compensate the childless man and woman by establishing the institution of adoption. Judaism did not need to create such an institution because it had a notion of redeemed, covenantal, spiritual parenthood." This does not mean that nature makes no claims upon those within the covenantal community. The natural tie of parents to child, Soloveitchik writes, is not liquidated or eliminated, since there is no power in the world which can nullify God's will. Rather, it is redeemed. It is infused with new meaning and purpose, and in that sense, Abraham is the father of many peoples with a fatherhood that, Soloveitchik says, surpasses by far fatherhood due to a natural process of fertilization of the ovum. The people who become children of Abraham and Sarah are not simply a clan or a tribe having a common biological ancestor. They are a redeemed covenantal community. Now, that does not overturn the subtle distinctions between nature and history in Jewish law, but it does give them a greater theological depth and complexity. What it will not do, perhaps entirely, is address the competing claims of nature and history with respect specifically to adoption. For when motherhood and fatherhood are elevated to a universal spiritual level, they refer less to specific children with whom one shares a familial history than to spiritual roles in the life of the redeemed community. In a somewhat different way from Soloveitchik's, spiritual parenthood also receives emphasis in Christian thought. I mean, in my own thinking, when I started down this road and started thinking about how this works in Islamic thought, it was apparent to me that Christians would not think in quite that way. But the question was why, sort of kind of what's going on, what makes the difference. And I think there is something that makes a difference. How this happens may be seen if we look very briefly at a talk given by Pope John Paul II at a meeting of adoptive families organized in September the year 2000 by the Missionaries of Charity, the order founded by Mother Teresa. The talk was given on the occasion of the Jubilee year of the order and on the 3rd anniversary of the death of Mother Teresa. At the very outset of the talk, John Paul reflects on the fact that she was known as Mother Teresa, though of course she had never given birth. A mother, the Pope says, is recognized by her ability to give herself. And then taking the anniversary as an occasion for remembering Mother Teresa's work of self-giving, he says, may help us all to understand what it meant to her beyond the purely physical dimension to be a mother. It helped her get to the spiritual root of motherhood. Move a little bit like Rabbi Soloveitchik's. Against the background of the centrality of the natural biological tie in Islamic thought and in somewhat different ways, but still there in Jewish thought, this emphasis on motherhood as an essentially spiritual bond is very striking. No doubt there's more that needs to be said, and no doubt there is more that the Pope on some other occasion might have said to provide further nuance, but just as clearly he has placed something other than natural procreation alone at the heart of the relation between parents and children. In this context, and remembering that this address was delivered to a meeting of adoptive families, John Paul notes that one of the services nurtured by Mother Teresa's movement has been adoption, which he then describes as a great exchange in love. Adoptive parents give much to the child whom they adopt, and in turn they find their desire to be a mother or father to a child fulfilled. And so he says, adopting children, regarding and treating them as one's own children, means recognizing that the relationship between parents and children is not measured only by genetic standards. Pope is quite clear that however rightly and highly we may exalt the natural biological tie, that tie the tie that is established through a shared familial history is every bit as profound, significant, and enduring. And in fact, he says precisely that. He says, the resulting relationship, that is after adoption, the resulting relationship is so intimate and enduring that it is in no way inferior to one based on a biological connection. Now, no doubt there's more that needs to be said. For example, when John Paul says at one point, he says there is a form of procreation which occurs through acceptance, concern, and devotion, we might wonder, or at least I might wonder, whether in order to underscore the moral significance of the love shown in adoption, it is necessary or even correct to characterize it as procreation. I mean, I'm not sure that's quite right. In any case, puzzles remain, and it is clear that some of those puzzles may be theological in character. The claims of nature and history informing the bond of children and parents are treated somewhat differently in these three religious traditions, presenting us once again with a problem for continued reflection. And then finally, my last illustration, a short one, you'll be glad to know. We need not turn to the world of high culture, to works like those of George Eliot, to be invited to think of complicated issues. Some of the most profound books are the short picture books written to be read to young children. And we should not be surprised to find that our problem, the interaction between nature and history in parenthood, is treated in those books, because those books are often very deep, after all. It's harder to be deep in that sort of book than if you write 400 pages. In P.D. Eastman's book titled Are You My Mother?, the claims of nature are given their due. The story begins with a mother bird sitting on an egg in her nest. The egg jumps, and the mother realizes that her baby will soon be there and will need to eat. She flies off in search of food. While she is gone, the baby bird hatches and finds himself alone. "Where is my mother?" he says. And that simple question generates a search which occupies the rest of the book. Off the baby bird goes looking for his mother, even though he's not yet able to fly, not quite knowing what his mother looks like. All he can do is ask those whom he meets whether by any chance they might be his mother. And so we meet various possible, though for the reader unlikely, candidates in page after page of the book. Kitten, hen, dog, cow, car, boat, plane. Each one gets the same question, "Are you my mother?" And the same negative answer is given. None of them responds affirmatively. And so the search continues. At last, the baby bird sees a big steam shovel. Caught up in its huge shovel, he is lifted high into the air and dropped back into the nest in the tree from which his search had begun. And then it says, just then the mother bird came back to the tree. "Do you know who I am?" she said to her baby. And of course, it turns out he does. He knows that she is not a kitten, hen, dog, cat, or any of those other possible candidates that he has met along the way. He says, "You are a bird, and you are my mother." And although they have not really shared any time together, the baby bird has found the right mother for him, the mother naturally suited for him, and all is well at the end of the story with mother and baby bird nestled safely together once again in the nest. Now, Are You My Mother is an engaging story. It's a nice story. But at least for this reader, perhaps not quite as good a story to read to one's child as a little book called A Mother for Choco, written by Keiko Kaja. In a sense, as you'll see, these two books are almost the same story, just in reverse in certain ways. Choco is a little yellow bird with striped feet who lives alone. It says he wished he had a mother, but who could his mother be? One day he set off to find her. And then we're treated to roughly the same sort of search. Choco meets a giraffe, but lacking wings, she cannot be his mother. He meets a penguin who does have wings but does not have the big round cheeks like Choco, so she can't be his mother either. He meets a walrus. She has the needed round cheeks but lacks the striped feet. Still other animals, an elephant, a turtle, a rabbit are pictured, but it says no matter where Choco searched, he couldn't find a mother who looked just like him. Then Choco sees Mrs. Bear picking apples. He's sure she cannot be his mother because she doesn't look anything at all like him. He starts to cry, and Mrs. Bear comes running to comfort him. As she listened to Choco's story, she sighed. "Oh dear, if you had a mommy, what would she do?" She would hold me, Choco says. And so Mrs. Bear hugs him tight. She would kiss me, Choco says. Like this, asks Mrs. Bear, and she lifts him up and gives him a big kiss. She would sing and dance with me, says Choco, and Mrs. Bear sings and dances with him. Perhaps, Mrs. Bear suggests, perhaps she could be Choco's mother. But, says Choco, you aren't yellow and you don't have wings or big round cheeks or striped feet like me. True enough, Mrs. Bear acknowledges, but nonetheless, she takes Choco home with her where an apple pie and her other children are waiting. Those other children who rush out to greet her turn out to be a hippopotamus, an alligator, and a pig. They eat the pie and laugh and sing together, and the story ends, after their delicious treat, Mrs. Bear gave all her children a big warm bear hug, and Choco was very happy that his new mommy looked just the way she did. Now here in this story, the claims of a shared history are accentuated and given their due, and differences of nature notwithstanding, who would not want a mother like Mrs. Bear? The two children's stories, similar in so many ways, and both sort of wonderful stories in many respects, the two stories tilt in different directions when weighing the claims of nature and history, and we are left to puzzle over which we would choose to read to our children. What you have then are 4 illustrations, each in its own way inviting us to see in adoption an instance within the moral life of the relation between, on the one hand, the givens of nature, and on the other hand, our historical freedom. To return to where I began, it does not seem quite right to refuse to recognize that Laius and Jocasta are parents to Oedipus, nor does it seem quite right to call them his parents. Even so, nature and history somehow meet uneasily in our practice of adoption, and as an exchange in love, as John Paul called it, as an exchange in love, adoption makes clear that whatever else we say, the claims of nature must, for Christians, be markedly qualified, even if they should never be denied. In an essay thinking through his own experience as an adoptive father, Russ Richter offers a kind of perceptive observation about 2 meanings of the word, the English word cleave. In some contexts, what cleave means is to split apart or to separate. In other contexts, it means to hold close together. The first of those, to separate, might be taken as a description of a biological child's entry into his or her family, separating from the tie with the mother. The second of them, to hold close together, might remind us of how an adopted child enters into the adoptive family, being drawn into close relation with his or her parents. And Richter then notes what is, I think, the crucial point. The resultant bond created by this cleaving of children is indistinguishable between the 2 cleaving methods. Thank you very much.
Gil, I enjoy it very much. First,
Where's the but? No, go ahead.
I hope my voice is understandable. I have just 2 stories that may highlight some of what you pointed out. About 25 years ago, there were a whole bunch of studies of identical twins raised from birth apart. They shared behavioral characteristics, showing the genetic basis of much ordinary behavior. The second is the process in Judaism by which a Gentile converts. For the men, obviously, circumcision and immersion in a mikveh, and convincing an Orthodox rabbi he will keep the law. When that happens, he's given the name now so-and-so Ben Noah, Ben Abraham. son of Abraham. His sister, if she goes through the conversion, being immersed, is given the name so-and-so by Sarah. Now, under Jewish law, they may now marry because they're not related. It seems is regarded as genetically transforming the people. However, there's a rabbinic law, so it's not to give scandal, which forbids it.
Thank you, Tris. And essentially what you've done is underscore the fact that both nature and history have important claims on us, and figuring out how to sort out the relationship between them can be very complicated.
So, Mark Cherry, I teach philosophy at St. Edward's University. Actually, we know each other well. I'm just going to add a layer of complexity to the analysis. One of the interesting things in looking at whether or not biology matters is that when you remove children from being raised by married, biologically related parents, the risk of abuse, neglect, and even sexual abuse goes way up. So, for example, a very risky environment to raise a child is single mother with live-in boyfriend. Okay. Now, in terms of the biologists, they would look at adoption and say, what do we anticipate finding? We have two parents non-biologically related, it'll be really bad for the kid, for the child. Then what's interesting is in places like the United States and Western Europe, where they track adoption fairly well, the disadvantages seem to go away. But once you step outside of the circumstances where they're tracking for adoptive parents, they don't go away. You find actually really high levels of abuse and neglect and even things like sexual abuse. So I just add it as a layer of complexity to the analysis that's worth puzzling and thinking about.
No, thank you. Those studies are, well, I'm just not a sociologist, I guess. Those studies are always tricky. There's so many things to control for, but I think it's true that a child being raised by a mother and father who are married to each other is less likely to have various kinds of problems than children who are raised in other circumstances. People often put that, and the way you put it in your first sentence was children who are raised by their biological mother and father. But I think the crucial thing is being raised by their mother and father. In adoptive cases, of course, it's not a biological father and mother.
Depends on whether you're tracking, how you're tracking and regulating the adoption. Because outside of, the data shows outside of countries where they can track and regulate adoption pretty well, you don't find the advantages that you have in a place like the United States for adopting children.
Well, that may... Okay, fair enough.
Hi, thank you very much for your remarks. I wondered whether you might comment on this tension between nature and history in the context of women who are facing crisis pregnancies. In the context of women who are facing crisis pregnancies. The literature suggests that, by and large, adoption is not considered as an option for women in those situations because the fear of their child being out there raised by strangers induces more guilt than the thought of abortion. And so, by and large, they choose abortion to a greater degree. And in part because of this, I think, tension between nature and history. And I wondered if you might just comment on that paradox that we see in women.
Sure. It is a puzzle to me. Though I will say, just a prefatory remark to commenting on it, that in this sort of a context, I am conscious of the fact. I get awfully tired of the appeals to the specifics of women's experience or men's experience, something like that. But in this context, I am conscious of the fact this is a man commenting on this, okay? I just can't give birth, and don't want to, in fact. But, you know, I taught for 40 years before entering into that blessed state of retirement, which is very good. And almost every year, except when I was on leave, I think I always taught a course. It was variously titled over the years, but most of the time I called it something like Moral Problems in Religious Perspective. And I would do about 4 different problems in the course of the semester. I always did abortion as one of the problems over the years. Somewhere along the way, of course, the possibility comes up that, well, one could carry a child to term and put the child up for adoption, that it doesn't sort of enslave you to raising the child for life. Of course, sometimes the problem was it interrupts my career or something like that, but most often what the 18 to 22-year-old young women whom I taught all those years would say is that I just couldn't bear the thought of my child, not knowing what happened to my child, and my child being raised by someone else and so forth, to which I would always say, now I was a man saying it, I would say, you mean, so, I mean, I'd try to be my gentle, sensitive self. I'd say, I understand, I can see how that would be difficult and so forth, but the alternative is your dead child, is that really? And you described it as a paradox in the last sentence of your comment. To me, it was very puzzling, but on the whole, that response did not get anywhere with them. Now, if we're to get, what that suggests to me is not that this is an impossible fear to overcome, but that it's not going to be overcome in the sterile setting of an academic conversation or anything like that. It can only be overcome it would have to be in a situation where there's a kind of a trust that's established between the woman who's pregnant and an adoption agency or children's service agency, perhaps a relation established with the adoptive parents to be, so that the young woman or the woman of whatever age is not just sending her child off into an entirely unknown world. Whether that will accomplish it or not, I don't know. I only know that I just sort of anecdotally can say that time after time after time, that was the response I got. And somebody better than I has to work on figuring out what sort of relationship has to be established with such a woman in order to encourage her to do something that I'm perfectly prepared to grant is very hard, and that there will always be loss involved in that. But it still needs to be done.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm wondering if in your own reflections you've kind of settled on an understanding of the essential nature of parenthood. I think in your remarks you've kind of thrown out a couple different possibilities or contenders, kind of the nature, as you put it, in the history. And it seems like you, from what I can gather, you wouldn't want to claim that either of those taken by themselves is the essential nature, but they may play a part in the essential nature. And I'm wondering, in particular, if you think some of what you shared about John Paul II's remarks, if that might offer kind of a solution to the essential nature that kind of combines those elements that you had mentioned. When you shared with us that, John Paul II's understanding of the spiritual dimension of motherhood as being kind of the essential element of motherhood and recognized by the ability to give oneself. I'm wondering if some of your thoughts on whether or not that could be kind of the essential nature, but can fit with both the nature and the history, where the nature is understood as a biological giving of oneself, and the history as kind of the giving of your life and your time.
I'm probably going to disappoint you because I don't know if I can give a satisfactory answer, but granting all the importance of the language John Paul II uses, I mean, I do not wish to underrate the sense in which nature has a kind of priority. Because for Christians who do that talk, we're not talking nature, we're talking about our created nature. And we wouldn't, I think, we would think that something had gone wrong in a world where we just sort of took all children and redistributed them to adoptive families from the outset, rather than having their natural parents ordinarily raise them. The created relation provides us a kind of paradigm for what a parent-child relation should be, which is why I think that at least whenever possible, a child to be adopted should be adopted by a husband and wife. I'm not a big fan of single-parent adoption, though there are children who nobody else will adopt, and sort of, I guess, God bless the people who do adopt them. But the natural relationship does provide a paradigm which the adoptive relationship mimics or imitates in a way. So then in that sense it has priority. But that said, I do want to agree with John Paul and with that passage from Russ Richter that I read at the end, that the adoptive relationship is every bit the equal of the natural one and is in no way inferior to it. I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but it's the only one I've got.
In passing, I do have a question, but I wanted to, in passing, add to your list of profound children's books. When you were talking, I thought of Horton Hatches the Egg, companion to my favorite profound pro-life book, Horton Hears a Who, in which the irresponsible mother abandons her egg to go play the tables at Vegas, and abandons her egg to probably be exposed to the elements and die. And Horton the elephant actually sits on the egg, and but then the mother comes back and says, "Well, that's my child." And the confusing thing is that while they're arguing, the egg hatches, and what comes out is sort of a flying little elephant. Very cute. This would be more of a frozen embryo adoption. I don't know. Intermediate case. But what I wanted to ask about adoption is, it seems to me the other consideration with women who are unintentionally pregnant not choosing adoption is that they want an option that allows them to, for whatever reason, it's partly, the whole thing happened in a very traumatic episode. They want to be able to move on with their lives and have closure. They want to set aside this part of their life and move on, which is the opposite of worrying about their child, worrying about being adopted by strangers. They want that child to have his or her own life, and they want to have their own life. But because of the way in which kids now are urged to search for their real parents, that closure is never possible. Because there are open records now, any mother who gives her child for adoption could be greeted at her doorstep by a child who is rightly or wrongly seeking that connection and that true motherhood. So there never is closure. You're always looking over your back. They want closure, and the only thing that they think gives them closure, unfortunately, is abortion. It doesn't matter whether it's live child or dead live. They want to be able to move on. And so it's given me great misgivings about the history of open adoption and the search movement, because I think it keeps many women from seeing that as an option that allows that closure to take place. I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
Well, I'm going to give you sort of a yes and no. I hold what may be a kind of a confused position on this question, but on the one hand, I'm basically a believer in open adoption, that records should be open and available, mainly because I think that the parent-child relation should always be founded in truth, and that there should not be the truth should not be hidden. That doesn't mean that, you reveal the truth in age-appropriate ways. You don't just, deliver a long lecture about it to your 1-year-old. But I'm a believer in open adoption at the same time that I think, sort of in agreement with what you said, that something disturbing is going on and happens sometimes with this this thirst to find one's real parents, who may have been nothing more than a sperm or an egg donor, which actually doesn't qualify as being a procreator in my view, to be honest. We live in a very confused age. I'm looked at from the side of the parent rather than the child. People, in order to have what they choose to call a child of their own, will use a donated sperm and ovum. So I think that we have learned to think of ourselves as passive in relation to our genes, that our genes somehow just determine who we are. And that's a mistake. We should not think that way. We should discourage people from thinking that way, while not prohibiting them from searching out their genetic origins. So that I do favor open adoption records, but at the same time, I would look for ways to discourage this, what I think is a sort of a mistaken sense that who I am is somehow determined by a sperm and an ovum from somewhere. It's just not the case. And if you think about it, it's an extraordinarily, as I said, an extraordinarily passive view of the self, that somehow determines who I am. It doesn't and it shouldn't.
Yep. Okay.
We have to let Paul McHugh ask a question. That's just
I'm Paul McHugh from Hopkins, and I think you and Richard together probably have answered my question, because it was somewhat of the same line. I wondered whether, in your looking at this issue of adoption, you did notice and wondered whether it was a natural inclination for the adopted child, when he grows up or she grows up, often to want to see who his natural parent was. Now, you remember that when we were in the council, the Bioethics Council, one of the public meetings, we had a group of people who were the products of medical student donors when 30 years before. By the way, I happened to be one of the people that was approached and said, "Not on your life, baby," at medical school to donate. And so when we were on the council and heard these very nice people want to know who those medical students were, I could say it wasn't me. But I wondered whether you thought further about this inclination, whether it was natural or whether, perhaps as Richard suggested, it might have been something promoted by a cultural force now. People even now wish to go back to Russia and the Soviet Union to find who they are. So it does seem to be something in the issue that you distinguish between history and nature. Maybe there's something there that wants nature to ask more of history than we're ready to give it.
Well, how about if let me take them one at a time. Okay. It would confuse me way too much to try to. More women than men search, by the way. That's I have no explanation for that, but it seems to be a fact. I don't deny that there's that there may be a kind of a natural urge for that in some cases, though how we distinguish a natural urge from one that's kind of culturally cultivated, I'm not altogether sure. It's also true, though, that there are adopted children who seem to feel no inclination whatsoever. And I have a good bit of sympathy with them, to be honest. As I said, I think we should live in truth. The truth should be available, but I don't go through life making problems for myself unless enough arise, I find. So I don't see any reason to kind of cultivate that desire. There may be some kind of natural reason to wonder about it. Some children may just feel themselves like Daniel Deronda, somehow not quite fitting. Okay, but I wouldn't cultivate it. Other question, yes.
So my name is Lorenza Violini, and I teach constitutional law at the University of Milano, Italy. How do you feel about creating, framing sort of constitutional right for knowing my own genetic origins? I pose this question because we had it during a process, a constitutional trial, on heterologous fertilization, which was prohibited, and the court admitted it. But then, by admitting heterologous fertilization, they completely overlooked the fact that people do want to know their origins, genetic origins, and they deny even the hypothesis of a constitutional protected right to genetic identity. So how would you judge this decision? How do you feel about a decision to exclude the right of knowing your genetic origins? Thank you.
My aging ears. She wants to know about the question of having a constitutional right to know one's genetic origins. Is that?
Yes,
well,
this is my question.
I'm not a legal scholar, of course. It's a good thing.
Well, this is why I ask you,
right? Yeah.
Because you're not a legal scholar.
My ideal constitution would be entirely silent on such a question. That is to say, it would not give such a right to know one's origins. It would not set some kind of insuperable roadblock to knowing them. It would just be silent on the question, leaving societies to fashion their legal arrangements, perhaps even in somewhat different ways, but rather than enshrining those some way in a constitutional provision, I would want a society to think it through and talk it through. As I said, my own view, which could be wrong, is that one should be able to know the truth about such matters if one wants to. We shouldn't. Our familial relations should not exist with some kind of hiddenness or deception marking them in some ways. But having said that, I think it's quite fine if a lot of people feel no urge whatsoever to pursue such questions. I don't think they're that important, to be honest.